You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock.
If you've tuned into this program before, you may have observed our frequent discussions emphasizing that economic development extends beyond mere economic growth. For example, growth of income from oil or gas does not necessarily lead to development. Development thus implies not just growth over a significant period of time, but also progressive changes in the structure of an economy. What then is the institutional foundation for such economic development? Many influential scholars, such as Douglas North, have identified the crucial role of property rights and the importance of constraining the power of the state, while others highlight the importance of political settlements and so-called development clusters. And on this show, Daron Acemoglu has argued for the crucial importance of inclusive economic and political institutions. My guest, however, argues that social scientists, including institutional economists, are yet to provide a systematic response to the question of the institutional foundations of economic development. Shipping Tang is the Fudan Distinguished Professor and Dr. Sika Chan Chair Professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University, China. In his latest book, he argues that institutions play a pivotal role in shaping and influencing economic development through four key factors. These are possibility, incentive, capability, and opportunity. In addition, his framework on the institutional foundation of economic development encompasses 6 significant dimensions: political hierarchy, property rights, social mobility, redistribution, innovation protection, and equal opportunity. Sustained economic development, however, necessitates not only a robust institutional foundation, but also strong state capacity and well-crafted socioeconomic policies. Given the heartfelt dedication invested in producing this show, I would kindly ask you for your support in rating the program, sharing your thoughts through comments, and considering sharing the podcast across your social media networks. Please extend the invitation to your friends and colleagues so that they too can become part of our shared journey. Shipping, great to see you. Welcome to my home and welcome to the studio. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here, and thank you for having me.
One of the things that you argue in your book from last year is that for economic development, the most important question is, or the puzzle is a political one. And maybe economic development also has a sociological aspect. So help us understand how you conceive the concept, the idea of economic development with this political, economic, and sociological elements.
I'm not the first one who argued for this particular kind of a notion. So actually, Adam Smith was a political economist. So if you go back to his first page, and what he said was, the wealth of nations really determined by 2 aspects. One is really the skill, judgment, dexterity of its population. And the second is really important, is about the allocation of production factors to different sectors. Now, if we really kind of think a little bit one step further, any allocation has to have a certain kind of a political decision. So that's why I think even if you go back to Adam Smith, you will be able to recognize that actually the most crucial question is really how a society allocates its production factors to produce what different things. So sometimes you can produce nuclear weapons, sometimes you can produce drugs, sometimes you can produce, let's say, poison gas, but some other time you can produce clothing, food. So you can see whatever decision that has been made to allocate these kind of production factors into the different productions of goods, that is the most crucial question. So it's actually not so outlandish to think that economic development is first and foremost a political question. And then only the second, once you have a perfect market, then you have the purely economic transactional approach.
As you know, there's quite a lot of interest in democracy and development, that linkage. And there are, of course, certain exceptions in terms of non-democracies having, developed quite rapidly. The East Asian tiger countries, the developmental state is that exception. China, a lot of people would say, is the exception. But generally, among political scientists, there's increasingly the belief that democracy is good, that there's a business case for democracy. And my mentor, who you also are aware of, Amartya Sen, has often argued that the most important aspect of democracy is that it makes the rulers aware of economic need, that without knowing what citizens need, rulers aren't able to design good policies. So how do you see that linkage between development and democracy?
I think there is a certain element of truth to that argument. And in my book, I also argue very explicitly that democracy may have certain value to economic development, but I want to very explicitly stress there is no direct, unconditional effect by democracy upon economic growth. So we have done quite a bit econometric exercise, including replicating and criticizing Darren A.C. Mugro's kind of piece in 2019 about in JPE. So I think their paper was really trying to establish a direct and unconditional effect between democracy and development. We don't think that effect is robust. Democracy is an institutional system that protects liberty. And by liberty, I mean political liberty and civil liberty. So democracy as a political institution is mostly about political things. Therefore, its connection with economic development, I argue, and also with fairly strong econometric evidence, is democracy only has an indirect, conditional, and channel-specific effect upon growth or development. So if you just do simple direct regressions between political score, like a polity score, to measure democracy with development, then you won't actually be able to get a robust positive association between democracy and development. Right. So let me add one more point. We should be able to understand the reason why sometimes you won't be able to get a direct regressional result between democracy and development is actually democracy may actually have different effects in terms of direction upon economic development. For instance, there is a certain element of truth, at least from our econometric evidence. Democracy may not be positive for capital formation, but it may be very important, as I argue in my book, very important for innovation. Innovation means two things. One is technological, the other is institutional. And I think democracy has a positive effect once the economy reaches a certain stage that it needs to grow with innovation rather than by following up. So therefore, for most developing countries, democracy has its own value in terms of political decisions, but in terms of economic development, democracy is not a necessary condition for at least jumping start the initial economic development, because for most developing countries at the very beginning, all it needs to do is actually have certain basic institutional arrangement that has been well established that will be used for economic growth. For instance, you need stability. You don't want to have violence and civil war. And second, you need a decent degree of property rights protection. And third, perhaps you need some kind of a investment in primary education and healthcare.
Well, this reminds me a little bit about what Jagdish Bhagwati was arguing in the 60s and 70s.
Exactly. We actually cited them.
The cruel choice dilemma, that it was a cruel choice. You could not have both, either have democracy or development. But it has to be said that Jagdish changed his mind and he said he was wrong.
When he was writing in the 1978, if I recollect, anyway, we cite both his articles. But in 2000, he changed his mind. And Also notice we actually use another very important scholar, I think Manco Olsen. He had also changed his mind. So in a way, when he was writing in 80s, 81, right, the Rise and the Fall, and he was mostly arguing you need to break interest groups. How can you do the, breaking the interest groups? You need the kind of a war and violence. And that was, so it's an implication of that argument is certainly not for democracy. But in, I think, 1996 and also, 1993, he published a very prominent article in American Political Science Review, and he was saying, democracy is good. But the more important message of that article is actually stationary bandits are better than roving bandits, because roving bandits, they don't really try to encourage people to produce. They only want to become predatory state or predatory rulers. So, and that has a very important implication is for most developing countries, the first thing you need is to have social and political stability, and that has to be based on hierarchical institutional structure. It means you have a decent state in order to enforce nonviolence resolution of conflict of interest.
Institutions has become the big buzzword. There is considerable citation of Douglas North's work. There is a focus on property rights, whether it is democracy, inclusive political and economic institutions that Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson talk about in Why Nations Fail. I've talked with Daron about this on this show several times. Why do you think some of these established understandings of institutions are wrong? And how do you conceptualize the term institutions? Because institutions should be distinguished from organizations. And you also make this distinction between the functions of institutions and the forms they take. So first, how you understand institutions, and why do you think the Acemoglu-Robinson thesis, or even Douglas North's understanding of institutions, is perhaps incorrect in your view?
My view is not this work has been incorrect. I think has been oversimplified and incomplete, and therefore they paint incomplete and therefore potentially misleading picture about the roles of institutions in terms of driving or underpinning economic development. So their approach has four critical weaknesses. One is, I think they use or they invent too blunt concepts, right? So their concepts were just too blunt, and therefore they are in the risk of tautological kind of a confirmation bias, in the sense that once you invent the term inclusive institution versus exclusive or extractive institution, it's so easy to say, well, the reason why one country has developed is because it has inclusive institutions, and the reason why the other country didn't have economic development was because it has extractive or predatory institutions. I think so. That's one very important weakness. The second, I think, is really, I think economics has prided itself as a more or less deductive science or deductive field. But if you really read North or Robinson, Acemoglu work, and even Olsen's work, some of the key insight they actually have been able to produce was mostly inductive if you read them really closely. The most important case has been the British Glorious Revolution. But if you tend to think in a more kind of rigorous social science methodological point of view, that is not a well implemented research design, in the sense for a single case like the British Glorious Revolution and the British Industrial Revolution, a single case, you can have many different explanations, and it's very difficult to tell which one is correct and the other one is incorrect. So therefore, I don't think it's tenable to fully extrapolate lessons from a single case like the British Gross Revolution. So instead, we need a more deductive approach to combine or kind of synthesize our insight on how institutions underpin economic development. There are two other kind of aspects I also criticize, but I don't want to kind of bore our podcast listeners to the details. So I will just name those two most crucial critique I advanced in my book. If I may add just one more point. So the key is to start with a more or less deductive framework, and therefore we don't have to commit the same kind of mistakes or errors they actually committed in terms of saying overemphasizing property rights, overemphasizing constraint on the executives. These two are only two dimensions in terms of the institutional foundation for economic development, because the institutional system is a system. It has more than these two dimensions. As I explicitly detailed in my book, it has at least 6 major dimensions rather than just property rights or democracy as a way of constraining the executives. These two things may be important in different stage or phases of economic development, but they are not the sufficient condition for economic development. Democracy may not even be the necessary condition for initial economic growth.
I quite like the fact you make the argument that we need to have a non-Western lens to also understanding the role of institutions. Most of these authors rely on a Western perspective, in addition to, as you just said, a more deductive approach rather than the inductive approach. You talk about the Institutional Foundations for Economic Development, IFED, and you talk about 4 main functions, I think, of institutions that drivers, you emphasize, or drivers. That is possibility, incentive, capability, and opportunity. And these have 6 dimensions. But before we come to the dimensions, can you briefly explain to my listeners each of these aspects of possibility as a driver? What do you mean? Incentive is something that is often talked a lot about in the institutional literature. Capability, again, is it the Amartya Sen understanding of capability? And finally, opportunity.
There is a very important metaphor by Olson in his 1996 paper, it's Big Bills on the Sidewalk. That is actually a very useful metaphor. So my framework actually is a product in terms of my kind of extending some of his understanding about this particular metaphor. He had a very simple answer to this particular metaphor. So the story was like one full professor and one assistant professor walking down the street, and there was a 100 bill on the sidewalk. The assistant professor wants to pick it up, I'm sure, because he has a lower income. And then full professor said, well, don't bother, because if it's a bill is real, somebody must have picked it up. So you don't even have to bother. But if you really think about the metaphor thoroughly, Olson's answer about incentive is just simply oversimplified and mostly wrong in the sense, so we can assume or we can imagine, let's say, if both the full professor and the assistant professor, they were blind, they won't be able to see the bigger bills on the sidewalk. So the element of not being ability to see the big bills on the sidewalk is about capability, right? And we can even go further, right? Let's say if they're walking along a neighborhood with so much gang activity, bullets flying, they won't even go that neighborhood. Or they will be shot before they even got to see the big bill. So on that particular aspect, you can see there must be some kind of possibility for them to go there and see the big bills. So you already have, in addition to Olson's answer, say incentives, you need capability, you need possibility. Possibility is actually perfectly explainable with this particular setting. we can assume maybe the full professor will be able to say to the assistant professor, hey, I understand you actually saw the bill first, but I'm the full professor, and therefore I should get a $100 bill, because if you don't give it to me, I won't be able to provide you with a future positive evaluation for your tenureship, right? So you see, that already has more than just incentives. So I think Olson was, I think partially because I think Douglas North got the Nobel Prize in 1994, and therefore Olson was also trying to kind of recycle the incentive answer for that. So once you have that, you have all the 4 key drivers of how we can make people to produce good things for the society or for their own benefit. And therefore, you need more than just incentive. You need possibility, you need capability, and you also need equality of opportunity. That's a simple story behind the framework I use to develop the theoretical structure of this particular book.
Rather than discussing the 6 dimensions separately, I would encourage us to think a little bit about what you call the new development triangle. So you have institutions, as we've just discussed, on top. Then you could have on the other side state capacity. And then finally, the third point would be development policy. So within this triangle, it'll be interesting to hear you speak about the 6 dimensions of this approach, because institutions, we've already agreed, are formal and informal rules. Some would say state capacity is about the ability to get things done. It's more of an implementation issue. And then development policies vary depending on the context and the type of problem that one is trying to solve. So within this triangular approach, what is it then that you would say a low-income country that is trying to jumpstart development, how should they go about that? Would it be trying to maximize certain parts of this triangle? Is it a sequential order that one should be trying to have some institutions build state capacity and then have development policy? What is the way forward using this triangular approach?
Well, thank you. This is really a challenging question, not just theoretically, but also practically speaking. If we look at the triangle carefully enough, one can tell that I explicitly put state capacity in a kind of reversed, kind of as a foundation of this particular triangle. In the sense, state capacity is the key kind of a dimension that underpins the triangle. The reason is I do think you need a decent threshold of state capacity so that you can allow economic development to actually go forward. The reason is because you need a state that can at least somewhat control violence so that people will have the possibility and also have the incentive to produce goods. For many developing countries, as we can tell from whether it's anecdotal or econometric evidence, there's a strong, robust, positive connection between political stability and development. So you need that. But in order to have political stability, the state has to be able to control violence. So we can see in many African countries, once you start civil war, growth will collapse. Once you have the civil war ended, then the growth will just rapidly come back. So that's a very kind of intuitive way of looking at, say, why state capacity is important. But I also want to stress 2 other points. First is there is no panacea or there is no fixed menu for starting economic development. But I do think that once you have a fairly stable society without too much violence, you will be able to have economic development simply by allowing people to go on with their own life. So making things, selling things, and have a decent contract enforcing mechanism. The second is, although I do emphasize industrial policy or development policy as a part of this thing, I do think for most developing countries, they won't be able to implement a lot of industrial policy or development policy because their state capacity is weak. And also, it's not easy to have a success in terms of industrial policy. As we study China's industrial policy, China made a lot of mistakes in terms of investing in certain sectors by industrial policy. It had some success, but it's not easy to have a success. For a simple kind of way of looking at economic development in terms of at the initial stage of economic development, all the states needs to do is actually have stability or lack of violence, allowing people to make money, just like Adam Smith said 2.5 centuries ago, or as Deng Xiaoping was saying to the Chinese people, saying, you just let people get rich.
This is then a good time to talk about China. To have you here in my home is wonderful because I miss being in China. And the last time I was there was before the pandemic. And so I am just desperate to return, not just because of the food, but also to meet all my friends and students. And thinking a little bit now about China's historic success, at least the last few decades, of how it was able to jumpstart development. And I've had Justin Lin on the show talking about precisely that. One of the things that everybody highlights is this fantastic reduction in extreme poverty, and officially China does not have extremely poor people, even though there may be a couple of 100 million people who are not necessarily very poor, but nonetheless poor by whatever frugal standard that we undertake in terms of measuring poverty. Using your approach, the IFED approach, and using that lens, how would you characterize this huge success that most people agree of lifting 500 million people out of poverty in 20 years? And the Chinese experience is particularly interesting because China has not had the kind of institutions that we talk about in the West. China has not been a democracy. China has not had the type of property rights that Western countries have. So where would you place China in this framework of yours, in this triangular framework of institutions, state capacity, and development policy? What did China do right?
I would venture to argue, I think China did at least 4 or 5 things correctly, building upon some of the key foundations laid before the open and the reform era. Mao did a lot of wrong things, but he did implement 2 things which I think laid part of the foundation for the later stage of economic growth under Deng Xiaoping's open and reform. First, it was a fairly good investment in primary education. And second is basic healthcare, what they call the barefooted doctors, as some people know. So those 2 things, if we connect with the mainstream economic theory, it's really about human capital, or Gary Becker, Schultz. So by some kind of accident, perhaps, Mao was able to prepare the Chinese population to be a fairly decently educated population. It doesn't have to be higher education. It doesn't have to be elite university, although China has a few elite universities. So what I'm saying is these foundations laid under Mao was important for China to be able to rapidly import some basic technology from the West, from other already more advanced developing countries at that time, say South Korea, Singapore, or even slightly more so Japan. So therefore, China had a population that are fairly healthy, but also they have some basic education, so they will be able to go through the production line. And then under Deng Xiaoping, I think he did at least 4 or 5 things correctly. One is very simple, to allow people to make money. That's what Adam Smith said. We don't have to expect butchers, barbers to work for the whole society. All they need to do is actually just to work for their own life. And therefore, you will be able to allow people to make money, to survive, and then to thrive. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think was very important is he immediately decided, although he was facing quite a bit of opposition, to allow foreign direct investment to flow to China. That was also very important because China lacked the capital. And also with those foreign direct investment, you actually have a certain transfer of technology that actually was brought to China. They don't have to be really high-end technology. It can be just textile, shoemaking, or simple kind of a iron ore processing. On this particular aspect, I think China was aided by the fact there was a significant overseas Chinese population from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from Singapore, from Southeast Asia. They actually were the first kind of set of investors inside China, especially along the coastal areas of China, like Shenzhen. The third thing I think he did right was he didn't go through a Big Bang approach. That was also very important. It was actually even before 1989 or 1991, after the collapse of Soviet Union. I think Tang was fairly pragmatic in the sense, although he had some sense of direction, say China has to go with a market economy, China has to do away with a planned economy model. China also has to open up to the West rather than, say, staying with the Soviet Union model. But he didn't know, and I think that was to his credit. He has been a very modest man in the sense he knew he was very capable, but he also admitted he didn't know everything. And therefore, he said, we should do experiment. We should allow certain areas to experiment with certain things. And that's very consistent with what, the great philosopher or economists like people like Karl Popper or Friedrich Hayek were arguing. So you don't want to do whole-scale social engineering. You want to experiment. Or also the great social psychologist, Donald Campbell, he said, we need an experimental society. Finally, I think this is one particular aspect. I don't agree with Professor Lin Yifu. He has been a great friend and he has been supporting this particular book too. But I don't think the key reason why China has been able to grow so rapidly in the last 4 decades or so was because the government did a lot of things in many, many things. I think the exact lesson is just exact opposite. Because Chinese government during the planned economy era was controlling so many things, almost like totalizing the society. The key reason why China was able to grow in the past 4 decades or so was because the government has gradually reduced its intervention in many areas of economic life. So I tend to use this particular metaphor. So I say the Chinese government is like the tap water controller, right? So initial beginning, it controlled everything. There was no water spreading or diffusing into some aspects of society. So after in the opening reform, Chinese government was able to withdraw gradually, sometimes because the society demands it to, sometimes maybe the government realized it has to kind of cut it down, its intervention. And so in a way, the Chinese government in the past 4 decades was able to kind of spread the waters around the economy, and therefore domestic economy, entrepreneurs, small business will be able to gradually get some water and sunshine, and therefore it will be able to grow. Here, I want to echo what some of the East Asian development states models, like people like Chalmers Johnson, Amstein, they were arguing, saying, you need, especially for a country with the size of China, with a decent size of or population of engineers and scientists, you can implement certain industrial policy that will enable China to catch up more rapidly than, say, just by following comparative advantage, as Professor Justin Lin has argued. And therefore, I think that part China was able to learn from the experience of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, of course, Japan, and actually Germany and France.
I agree that some of the most important investments in social and human capital were done during Mao's period. Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze have argued that it is health, just making sure there are the number of doctors and nurses per 1,000 people, education. You can argue that maybe the quality was not great, but the foundations were set such that when the reforms took place and economic growth really was jump-started, China was able to build on those solid foundations. It wasn't as if suddenly one became rich because one was able to make those investments, which many other countries, including India, have not. You can't assume that economic growth will lead to better education, poverty reduction, unless these investments have been made. But there is also another point here with China, is that as much as one talks about China as a success story, it is also argued, Martin Ravelion, the late Martin Ravelion and others have argued that there is uneven development in China. So you have some parts that are on par with Europe, and then there are some provinces that have human development comparable to countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And in this context, I'd like to ask you about decentralization, because one sometimes gets this idea that everything is decided by Beijing. But in reality, and as you also show in your book in relation to education policy, it is actually the local leaders who have considerable power. And when I have studied corporate social responsibility or how Chinese companies are implementing sustainable development policies, the conclusion there has always been that the most important thing is to actually for companies to cultivate good relations with local leaders, right? So because they wield a lot of power. So the question then is, if you have local leaders wielding so much power, some of these development outcomes will also depend on the preferences of these leaders. If I am interested in promoting primary education or health, maybe my county will do well. So in that sense, you could say that there's a bit of it's a gamble, right? You need to have good leaders or leaders with the good right ideas for development. And I'm particularly interested in hearing not just your academic perspective on this, because you yourself were a mid-level official in Ningxia, and you were in charge of attracting foreign investment, but also domestic investment. So tell us a little bit about this power that local officials have in China.
That's going to be a very fascinating part of our discussion, and I'm glad that we'll be able to discuss a little bit. Let me start with the last part of your question, right? So how can we reconcile the preference or the different qualities, uneven qualities of local leaders and the result of economic development? That's why I emphasize in my discussion about state capacity a very key dimension of state capacity, which has not been well discussed or even marginalized, was what I call the decision-making or leadership with information capacity. So a very important function of bureaucracy, and that may be connect to some of the long tradition of Chinese had a Confucian kind of a bureaucracy, is this bureaucracy has to be able to provide information and therefore to allow some of the leaders to make quality decisions. So I don't see a contradiction, say, in some of the decision-making process. You don't need to have an entirely democratic discussion because, sometimes a leader may be wrong, sometimes maybe he's right. So discussion is important, but the key is for the leader to know the information, to have a good information flow, but also to make quality decisions. I think the key is to make these leaders, at least to some degree, accountable. And that's, I think, part of the value of having grassroots democracy in terms of checking and balancing some of the more reckless decisions. So that's one thing which I learned when I was a local bureaucrat. Now, the second thing I want to highlight on that particular part of my experience is this. I do think most bureaucrats, they have certain sense of, doing the job. So let's say when I was there, I was at least part of my responsibility to attract foreign direct investment, but also domestic investment. But the thing is, a lot of activities performed by local bureaucrats are not really about economic development. Their job is to provide the institutional foundation for economic development within a local environment. So their job are to say, doing the basic infrastructure building, like investing in primary education or basic infrastructure. So that, I think, is also important. They don't have to be directly linked to economic development. The third thing about local also connect to what we want to discuss in the next part of our discussion is really local inequality or the uneven development, which I think is it's inevitable because China is a vast country and different parts of this country has really tremendous variation in terms of income, distance to coast, distance to capital, distance to other manufacturing center, and also distance to higher education. So that part, I think, is inevitable for any country with the size of China. Now we can move to the uneven development in China. Again, let me give you a little bit with our listeners, also a little bit about my background. Right? So I was born in a very tiny village. It was like my village was less than around 15 households. It was it's not, when I was growing up, I didn't realize how isolated, how remote that place was. Although I came to meet some of my students or fellow students, they actually came from places who are even more remote than my village. But the story behind my village was like this. I last went back to my old village in 2017. But even in 2010, my part of village has gone. It's no longer exist. If I bring you there, I don't tell you that what used to be the house where I live. You won't be able to realize there was a house there. To use this particular aspect of my experience, I do think in some parts of China, you don't need people to stay there. You want people to get out of those places because those places, if you stay there, you won't have a higher income. That's not possible. You need a concentration of talent, concentration of investment, concentration of opportunities so that you will be able to grow. But I do realize there is no way you can, put or take people away from the home counties, home villages, and to all those coastal areas and ask them to stay there. So China, since its very beginning from the socialist part or socialist planned economy age, has always had what we call the transfer, really a distribution program from richer coastal areas to less developed place like Ningxia. When I was in Ningxia, I knew almost 70 to 80% of the total budget of Ningxia government came from the central government or was provided by really places like Shanghai, Guangdong, or Zhejiang. Right? So I do think this particular transfer of investment or credit or budget has a very important dimension to China's economic development so that inland areas will not be so lagging behind. Finally, I want to say, I don't think human beings will be able to entirely eradicate the effect of geography. This is not geopolitics. It's really just saying geography has a very important constraint upon human life. And therefore, once you have uneven geographical location, geographical landscape, there will always be certain inequality among different places. So that is, I think, my overall understanding some of the uneven development.
I am fascinated with your story because I have studied famines and I understand that your grandfather died during the Great Famine, 1960. You moved from Yunnan to Wuhan. You studied there. So there was social mobility in your case. and then you got into university, you went to the US, came back. In many ways, people of your generation, our generation, have seen everything from famine or hardship to this wonderful economic development. If you recall, just earlier today, I was telling you about how when I first went to Shanghai and standing on the Bund, where you have all the Chinese tourists coming of a certain generation, elderly people looking at Pudong and seeing the skyscrapers, it is this feeling that, wow, our country that was poor is now doing so well. So thinking a little bit about your own journey and China's journey, in the final section of our conversation, I'd like you to please reflect a little bit on this big challenge that all countries have to achieve long-run economic growth. That is the goal for many, not just growth that just takes place dramatically and then stops. You want to have sustained economic growth. How do you see China today? Because there are these concerns that economic growth, whether it is because of the pandemic or other factors, is slowing down. That there are also others I've had on my show saying that maybe there's a risk that China may not even want to trade with the world because it has such a huge market. It'll close down. At the moment, there's quite a lot of demand domestically. How do you see the future of economic development in the world? If the Chinese economy sputters, then that's going to have huge ramifications. So what must it take for sustained economic growth in China today?
Yeah, I do think in terms of kind of my journey from the small village to universities, to the US, and then going back to China and work, it's a very important reflection of the path that China has been able to travel in the past 4 decades or so. I think 2 key things should be underscored in terms of understanding how China has been able to move from that particular stage to what has been going on today. The first thing is, I think China was able to take advantage some of the restructuring of global value chain, and therefore the transfer technology, transfer production from developed countries like Japan, US, or UK or Germany to some less developed countries. So that was a very important historical juncture opportunity for a country like China. The second is, I think, the Chinese government has been mostly able to adapt, to assess, and to make reasonably well implemented policy. And that connects to what I said, state capacity. What I think is important for other countries when they look at the Chinese experience, but also the future of China, is I think they should be able to see certain trends and they can express their concern whether China will be able to sustain its growth, because, as you said, China's future growth is important to the potential growth of the world, because China is a number 2 economy today and actually trades with almost every country in the world. So there are 3 things I think I want to emphasize about the potential of China's economy. First is, I do think actually Chinese economy can actually grow faster than actually it has been able to achieve in the past couple of years. I do think China's economy has a lot of potential that can be released or re-energized with proper institutional change. For instance, I do think if China gradually democratized to a certain degree, it will be able to innovate in terms of not just technically, but also institutional-wise, and therefore China will be able to have more bottom-up institutional innovation, because institutional innovations are also important for sustaining growth. The second aspect we should be looking into China's policy or China's growth is really, a lot of people are talking about the aging society, which I think is important. So we have yet to see a robust kind of recovery of birth rate, but I think that's partially not just because younger generation, they may not be willing to having more children, but also really the cost of raising a child in cities, especially in cities. So I think the state has to realize the key impediment to a higher growth rate is really the cost of raising a child is tremendously expensive. And therefore, when you're adding housing, schooling, kindergarten, it's a tremendous burden. The third thing, which I think is, it's really about international politics, which I used to do a little bit more. And I think that gives me a kind of a different perspective in terms of understanding economic growth, and actually also connects how other countries can or cannot learn or emulate from some of the Chinese experience, which is, I think, the geopolitical, which I think is properly written will be the international political tensions between U.S., West, and to a last extent, India, Japan, and South Korea versus China. I think this particular period may actually last maybe 5 or 10 years. So what I'm saying is, I think we are witnessing a period of instability or perhaps upheaval in the future international order. So I think countries have to be fairly cautious in terms of engaging in certain risk, geopolitical or international relations kind of initiatives. I think countries have to pay attention to the potential rupture between China and the West. But I do think if China and the US and the West can really think things through, the benefit or the gain from their potential cooperation, or at least reducing tension, will be far more significant than what they can gain by fighting each other or by de-risking or decoupling from each other. Because whether you want to call it de-risking or decoupling, is enormously costly, and also it's bad for international trade. Finally, I would say, I think China, while being part of an international trading system, and so even if a lot of people can criticize, the One Belt, One Road initiative, I think people should be able to see the OBOR's initiative has been able to provide very important infrastructure building in some parts of the developing countries. So I've been to Ethiopia, I've been to Thailand, I've been to Philippines. So those countries, I think, just like China, they need investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure quality is important for any country in terms of sustaining economic development. So finally, I would say sustaining economic development is truly difficult. Success is very difficult. Well, it's easy to explain because mostly everything is right. Failure is very easy, but it's very difficult to explain. So part of our task is to understand why certain countries have failed for different reasons, why countries have been able to succeed for another set of reasons. And I think that's a very important task for us as a social scientist, to be able to provide important lessons for every country in this particular world.
Xiping, it was such a pleasure to have you visit me today. Thank you very much for this lovely conversation and for coming on my show.
Thank you so much, Tang, for having me. It was a really great conversation.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please spread the news among friends and colleagues and share the link to the podcast on social media. You can tag us on Twitter at GlobalDevPod and Dan Bannock.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.